Welcome to the Japan Forum webinar series. Hello, everybody in Japan. It's Wednesday morning. In California, it's Tuesday afternoon. I'm Ulrike Schede, and I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion of Abenomics. Before I do so, let me tell you a little bit of where you are. We are at the University of California, San Diego, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. GPS offers 7 degree programs, including a master's in international affairs. If you'd like to know more about our degrees, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. At GPS, we have a Japan Center. It's called JFIT, Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. JFIT conducts research, in particular also this webinar series, and connects Southern California and Japan. If you'd like to know more about what we do at JFIT, please go to jfit.ucsd.edu. I also have a website that I invite you to visit, thejapanologist.com. Our webinar is a weekly event, and today we're going to talk about Abenomics. If you have to leave early before I can make my final announcement, please note that next week we'll have Gent Isayama, the CEO of WIL, the World Innovation Laboratories, and we're going to talk about innovation, entrepreneurship, and change management in Japan, followed by the Carlos Ghosn saga, and we'll have Bruce Aronson, who's one of the leading law scholars on this matter, followed by a number of other topics like the 2040 energy mix discussions. We'll bring Ruth Benedict back and also talk about Japan and Asia. So please stay with us, tune in to our website where we'll have the registration page. All right, and today, let me now move on to show my co-discussants today. I have with me Phillip Lipscy and Harukata Takenaka. So let me introduce these two gentlemen. Phillip is a professor of political science, a chair in Japan Politics and Global Affairs. He's also the director of the Center of the Study of Global Japan. That's a good title for a book, Phillip. Global Japan at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in Toronto. He earned his MA at Stanford and PhD at Harvard in political science, and he is the co-editor of a book titled The Political Economy of the Abe Government and Abenomics Reforms. And he'll talk about that book a little later. I think, Phillip, will come out in 2021. It's currently in copy editing state. Thank you for joining us. Professor Harukata Takenaka is professor at GRIPS, which stands for the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. For those of you in Japan, that's the English translation of the Seisaku Kenkyu Daigaku in Daigaku in Tokyo. Takenaka sensei earned his BA from Todai and his PhD in political science from Stanford. He initially joined MOF. He's a Ministry of Finance bureaucrat and was deeply involved in administrative reform in the mid-1990s. Today, he is, I understand, an advisor to the Abe government. So he's not speculating when he will tell us about some of the reforms that are currently going on in the Abe government. He's also an author in the same volume that I just mentioned that Phillip is a co-editor of. So, gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining me. The audience, please note that you can type in Q&A questions that I will later bring into the discussion. What I'd like to propose is that we'll have both of our speakers talk for about 10 minutes or so to give us some initial ideas that we can then build on. And let me suggest that we start with Professor Lipscy and followed by Professor Takenaka. So Phillip, the stage is all yours. I'll spotlight you
good.
And let's hear it from you.
All right, sounds good. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So thank you very much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. As Ulrike kindly introduced, I'll be talking about the political economy of the Abe government. And to give you a little bit of background on this, what I'm talking about comes from an edited volume co-edited with Professor Takeo Hoshi at the University of Tokyo on this topic of the political economy of Abe and Abenomics. It's forthcoming from Cambridge University Press in March 2021. So hopefully you can take a deeper dive once it's out. Contributions come from a wide variety of top experts on Japanese politics and the Japanese economy. And today we're going to very narrowly focus in our 10-minute presentations on some of the political implications and findings. But the book also has chapters on foreign policy, history issues, macroeconomics, agriculture, labor market reforms, just to mention a few. So I hope you take a look at the book once it's out. All right, so to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. So my presentation is going to be about how has Abe governed Japan during his tenure as Prime Minister. And I'll talk about what we describe as the Abe model, which includes three principal components: a strategy for managing popularity and public approval, party discipline through the use of snap lower house elections, and the centralization of authority, which will connect directly to Harukata's presentation. I'll talk very briefly and speculatively about some of the problems that the Abe model might have encountered during the current COVID pandemic as well. So just to do a brief overview of the Abe government, which many of you are perhaps familiar with. Abe is now the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, going back to the Meiji period. And he has also enjoyed among the highest average public approval ratings of Japanese prime ministers, around 48%, in the similar range as Koizumi, another very popular prime minister, and much higher than prime ministers during the old 1955 system. Abe has also implemented very significant economic reforms under the banner of Abenomics in a variety of sectors of the Japanese economy. Of course, some have been more successful than others, but the Abe government has also been the subject of significant controversy. So as an academic, this is a very interesting thing to study. So just to give you some basic data. So this is Japanese nominal GDP, which you see has grown fairly robustly during Abe's tenure. The economists in our volume suggest that Abe's policies probably had something to do with this, and we see a little bit of a drop off there as the pandemic hit. But in terms of aggregate growth, Abenomics does appear to have achieved some success. Similarly, unemployment has declined to levels comparable to previous lows achieved during the bubble in the early 1990s. And incidentally, there's been a slight uptick during the pandemic, but Japan's unemployment rate still remains quite low in international comparison. So turning very quickly to the political strategy, we'd argue that Abe and his close advisors sought to establish a governance structure that matches Japan's reformed political institutions. So this is electoral reform and administrative reforms that began in the 1990s. And they sought to incorporate lessons that have accumulated during the Koizumi government, in which Abe was chief cabinet secretary, Abe's first tenure that was very brief, and which they see as a failure that gave them important lessons on how to govern, and the DPJ government that also had some important problems in governance. The key components of the Abe model, the first one is popularity management. So there's a very intentional effort to try to make sure that Abe remains popular with the Japanese public. And this is because the current Japanese electoral system rewards prime minister popularity. It's not the old system where if you have a very strong local support base, you could continue to be elected even if your party or prime minister are not doing so well. The fortunes of the LDP are very much tied to the fortunes of Abe. And so it's very critical for Abe to maintain a high degree of popularity. And the LDP cannot rely on its policies being popular. So Smith, Horiuchi, and Yamamoto have a very nice paper where they use survey evidence to show that the LDP's policies as articulated in their manifesto, are not very popular. Opposition party policies are actually much more popular than those of the LDP. However, Abe and his advisors see Abenomics as quite critical to keeping Abe's popularity level high. The Japanese public, in their view, support reforms and they support reformist politicians. And so the idea that they have governed based on is to pivot to popular Abenomics reforms before elections when the Prime Minister's popularity matters critically, and during situations when Abe's public approval rating is suffering, such as during scandals. They've complemented this with a media strategy that intentionally tries to project a positive image of the Prime Minister. So, for example, they've reduced the exposure to the Prime Minister to the media by eliminating, for example, burasagari interviews. This was actually eliminated under the DPJ. It's an opportunity for media to ask questions to the Prime Minister directly. And Abe has said that this is one of the most important achievements of the DPJ government, is to get rid of these interviews. And they've also tried to control the media narrative by prioritizing interviews with the conservative media rather than rotating among media sources as was done traditionally, and using the broadcast and radio law to pressure critical voices in the media. And so this has arguably contributed to the Prime Minister remaining relatively popular in the public eye, but it has also come at some cost to Japan's international reputation. So this is Japan's press freedom ranking, according to Reporters Without Borders. And as we see under the Abe government, Japan has declined in terms of press freedom from about 20th or so in the world to around 70th today. So this media strategy, although it might have achieved some success domestically, has not been costless for Japan's international image. So the second pillar is the use of snap lower house elections by Abe. One major challenge the Japanese political parties and prime ministers have faced in recent years is internal conflict. So we saw this very prominently during the Koizumi period, when he was constantly fighting with conservative elements within the LDP. We also saw it during the DPJ government with the Ozawa faction and more reformist politicians. It's very hard to maintain party cohesion when you have large majorities in the Diet. Abe has solved this problem by very effectively using both actual and the threat of snap lower house elections to keep backbenchers in line. And for this, the 2014 election was pivotal. I won't go into the details, but basically there was a little bit of an internal conflict or tussling with pro-Ministry of Finance Diet members in the LDP trying to undermine Abe's authority. And Abe successfully quelled this by showing that he is willing to call an election and maintain party discipline. And so the strategy here that Abe used was quite similar to the 2005 postal election under Koizumi, even though it wasn't publicly framed in those terms. And finally, centralization of authority. And I won't cover this in great detail because Harukata will do so in his presentation. But Abe has really accelerated trends that were already ongoing in Japan that centralizes more and more power in the Prime Minister and his office compared to bureaucrats and the party. So turning to COVID finally, one question that arises during Japan's pandemic response that I've written about elsewhere is what I call the COVID conundrum in Japan, which is that if you look at the basic data on things like COVID cases and COVID deaths in Japan, Japan has done quite well. This is the x-axis of this chart. Japan has had relatively few deaths from COVID-19, but this has not led to public support for Abe. In fact, if you look at the y-axis, which is change in leader approval rating, Abe's approval rating has declined since the beginning of the pandemic. So there's a little bit of a paradox here of relatively limited casualties from the global pandemic, but the Prime Minister losing public support. And I would argue that this exposes some limits of the Abe governance model. So a pandemic, unlike other kinds of challenges that Abe has dealt with, really imposes a trade-off between public health goals and economic growth. An aggressive response of the kind that other countries have used, such as locking down the economy or sharply curtailing economic activity, would threaten to undermine the progress that Abe has made using the various reforms implemented under Abenomics. And in this sense, I think Abe and President Trump of the United States share some similarities in that they both see economic achievements as core to their legitimacy and popularity. And intentionally undermining that is something that they were very hesitant to do. The Abe government has also attempted to go back to their very standard method of, as the prime minister's popularity declines and internal challenges from the LDP emerge, let's pivot back to our strength, which is economic growth and Abenomics. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, trying to pivot to economic growth leads to more spread of the virus and has ultimately backfired on Abe. And so this key strategy that has been so successful in the past during the pandemic has not worked as well as it could. I think the media strategy has also exposed some significant limitations. So Abe, as I mentioned earlier, has not been in front of the media very frequently. The strategy has been to prevent the media from being able to attach Abe's face to negative stories, for example. But during the pandemic, if you look at what kind of leaders have been quite popular internationally, like Justin Trudeau of Canada, they're in front of the media all the time, talking about their pandemic response and saying how they care about the people and how the government is laser focused on the pandemic. And the way Abe has dealt with this, I think, has created a public image that he's either aloof or distracted and not quite as focused on the pandemic as he could be. And finally, the pandemic, I would argue, exposes the limits of centralized authority under the Abe government. And this is because the pandemic really brings local governments into the picture. And one area where Japanese politics has not been centralized is the relationship between central and local governments. Local governments in Japan still have quite a bit of authority. And we've seen the governors of Tokyo and Osaka use this to hammer away at the central government response, saying the central government is not doing enough, we're going to do more, and so forth. So even though Abe does have significant control over the bureaucracy and his own party, he doesn't have the ability to control local governments to the same degree. And this has really been highlighted by the COVID pandemic. So that's all I have to say. I look forward to Harukata's presentation and the Q&A.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. So let me make sure I get us back in the picture. There we go. And now, Professor Takenaka, your microphone is muted. If you could get yourself, there you go.
Okay, there you go. Let me try
invite
this.
you to speak.
Hold on. Oh, here we go. Is it working?
Yes, it is.
Good.
If you could turn the slideshow on, then yes,
okay.
Very good. Excellent.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Ulrike, for having me here for this Japan Forum webinar series. And I'd like to give a talk, presentation on how Japanese Prime Minister has expanded in past 3 decades. And it's going to be a chapter in Phillip's and Hoshi-sensei's book. And okay. So it overlaps with what Philip has already explained. So just to give you a bit of introduction, as Philip has said, Prime Minister Abe has succeeded in staying in power for long years. He has become now the longest serving Prime Minister in Japan, including pre-war period. And many important domestic policies and also several important external policies such as TPP, TPP-11, and free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And as this is also covered by Philip, he has, well, Prime Minister Abe has more or less succeeded in keeping his approval rate high for a long time, although it has declined because of his response to COVID was not well appreciated by the public in recent days. And so the questions I raise is, why has Prime Minister Abe been able to keep his power and implement various policies? And what implications does Abe's premiership have on the nature of the Japanese political system? And answers, Ulrike said I have to make it in 3 points in her email, so 3 points. The Japanese Prime Minister power has expanded as an institution because, again, 3 points, three reforms: political reform of '94, administrative reform of 2001, and civil service reform of 2014. And under the current Abe administration, the power of the Prime Minister has grown even further. And Japanese parliamentary system has moved toward a Westminster model of parliamentary democracy. And to give you a perspective to perceive what has been happening in Japan for past 3 decades, I rely on a perspective given by your colleague from UC San Diego, Department of Political Science, Strom. He tries to model a parliamentary model under the perspective of principal agent model. And he perceives parliamentary system can be treated as a chain of delegation from the voters to the civil service, from voters to MPs to PM, and PM to minister and civil service. And under this framework, Prime Minister has several preferences. And as an agent, Prime Minister wants discretion from legislators as much as possible. And on the other hand, as a principal, Prime Minister wants to wants to have as much control as possible over ministers and public officials. But I think we can expand his model, and that other institutional arrangement for Prime Minister to retain more discretion and more control in policy formulation is possible. For example, Prime Minister can make some devices to extend his control over civil service directly. Or he can set up his own office or appoint his own officials to delegate some important policies. And so Prime Minister, to understand Japanese Prime Minister's relationship with other actors, there are some points. Relationship with MPs, he can exercise power of endorsement and also power of distributing financial resources. And as regards to the relationship with ministers and officials, he can exercise power over appointment, and also he can rely on institutions supporting Prime Minister. The most important institution is the Cabinet Secretariat. And various reforms change Prime Minister's relationship with other actors. And so I would like to go over from the old day of 55 system, how Prime Minister's power has expanded. So under the old 55 system, he didn't have much discretion from his principles. LDP factions had, there were strong LDP factions, and it was very difficult to formulate policies ignoring the policy orientations of factions and backbenchers. In other words, MPs had strong control over Prime Minister. And over the ministers, Prime Minister did not have much power over his agents, because the ministers, he did not have much discretion or autonomy in making ministerial appointment, because he had to respect recommendations from factions when he appoints ministers. And so LDP government, in effect, was a de facto coalition government. On surface, it was a single party government, but it was a de facto coalition government consisting from autonomous factions. And he had limited power to control ministers. And the political reform of '94 changed all this. I think the audience is familiar with this, but he came to have more discretion from his principles. because he can fight back against the backbenchers using his power of endorsement, because power of endorsement has become much more important under the new electoral system consisting from the single member district and the PR system. And he came to, and the power of factions became more marginal, and now he can exercise more discretion in making ministerial appointments. So now ministers are more loyal to Prime Minister, and Prime Minister can exercise. So under the PA model, MPs came to have less control over Prime Minister, whereas Prime Minister came to have more control over ministers. And this is, I just present one figure representing how the Prime Minister's power over Prime Minister's power in making ministerial appointment has expanded. So the blue line, I mean the orange represents the number of the MPs who are elected more than, who have the record of getting elected more than 6 times. In the past, there was a rule in LDP, if you get elected 6 times, then you are a minister. That means regardless of your talent or your personality and your chemistry with the Prime Minister, you could become minister if you succeeded in getting elected 6 times. But this rule meant that Prime Minister really didn't have autonomy in making a ministerial appointment. And the blue line gives the ratio of those LDP politicians with ministerial experience, with a ratio of LDP politicians who have been elected more than 6 times with ministerial experience over all LDP politicians with a record of getting elected 6 times. So before this ratio was around more than 90%, meaning really, if you get most of the LDP politicians with a record of getting elected 6 times could become ministers. Under the Abe, so this has gradually declined, and currently it fluctuates between 60% and 70%. That means not all LDP politicians can, even if they get elected more than 6 times, can become ministers, because now Prime Minister carefully selects who becomes ministers. Okay. And then the second reform, which is administrative reform of 2001, he came to have the Prime Minister. This has made it possible for the Prime Ministers to have more control over policies. And so the most important reform is that we expanded the responsibilities and the power of the Cabinet Secretariat. Before the reform, Cabinet Secretariat had only power to coordinate policies among different ministries. But with the reform made it possible for the Cabinet Secretariat and Cabinet Office to formulate and design policies. So this has enabled the Prime Ministers to delegate important policies directly to Cabinet Secretariat and Cabinet Offices. So this has, instead of delegating important policies to several ministers, he can concentrate and bundle important policies delegate it to Cabinet Secretariat. And he can appoint one special ministers who formulate policies using Cabinet Secretariat. And this has made a delegation more effective and more efficient. And then, since the reform, the capabilities of Cabinet Secretariat has continuously expanded, as briefly introduced by Phillip. And this is the number of officials working in the Cabinet Secretariat, and the total number was, originally around 800 in 2000, but now it's expanded to 3,000. Okay, and And also, when Cabinet Secretariat formulates policy, normally Prime Minister creates a special policy unit in Cabinet Secretariat. For example, when Prime Minister wants to start TPP negotiations, he creates a special policy unit for TPP negotiations in Cabinet Secretariat, and he delegates policy formulations related to TPP negotiations to this policy unit. And the number of special policy units has also grown enormously. It was around 10 before the reform, but now it is around 40, meaning that our Cabinet Secretariat formulates much more policies than before today. And okay, and most importantly, this is the bills prepared by the Cabinet Secretariat. Before, the Cabinet Secretariat had only power to make coordination, it was very difficult for the Cabinet Secretariat to draft legislations. But now Cabinet Secretariat can prepare and can formulate policies. It can also prepare and draft important draft bills. And so on average, Cabinet Secretariat annually prepares 5 to 7 bills, and most of these bills are most important bills of the cabinet. And the last reform, and the third reform, is the civil service reform, and it is a creation, and also it is represented by the creation of the Cabinet Bureau of Personal Affairs, and this reform increased the Prime Minister's power on appointment of high-ranking officials in the ministries. Before the reform, it was really the department ministers who decided the personal policy and appointment of high-ranking officials in their ministries. But after the reform, ministers now have to consult with Prime Minister before making appointment. And now, so that in the PA principal agent model, Prime Minister before the reform, the control over the civil service was indirect, but now he can project direct control over civil service. And also, this is also another institutional reform was carried out under the Abe cabinet, which is the creation of National Security Council and National Security Secretariat. And in other words, the Abe cabinet created the National Security Secretariat in the Cabinet Secretariat to coordinate security policy, which used to be handled by Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense. So now the Prime Minister has much more political clout for policy formulation, even in the sphere of security policies. And so what is the implications of all these reforms? These reforms expanded the Japanese Prime Minister's power, and it made the Japanese government more cohesive and more centralized. And as a result, the Japanese parliamentary model shifted toward a Westminster model. But there remain important differences with the pure Westminster model, and because the Prime Minister still faces out of constraints. And I think I just refer to 3 major constraints, which is the structure of the diet itself constrains the Prime Minister severely, much more than British Prime Minister. And also we have much stronger second chamber than the Westminster model. With the second chamber has almost equal power with the lower house. And the third point, which relates to this, the Japanese response to the current COVID crisis, is the power of the local governments. As a result of decentralizations which have been implemented through from the end of the 1990s, the local governments have strong autonomy, and it is very hard to control them, and it sometimes prevents the Japanese Prime Minister and the Japanese cabinet to formulate policies when the policy jurisdictions overlap with the local governors and local mayors. And so that, thank you very much for listening. And that's end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me see whether I can get all three of us in the picture. I think this should do it. All right, here we are. Thank you. That's great. We have a number of questions coming in, and they revolve around like three main themes. So I want to structure our conversation a little bit about that. The first is this popularity question, right? So there are a couple of very interesting things. One, you know, the popularity goes up and down almost like a fever curve. And so there's something about this. There was a time maybe 2 or maybe 4 weeks ago when popularity sank to like 8%, and then it kind of went up again. So there's something a little bit different. So when we hear that the popularity rating in Japan is 40%, that means something different from it being 40% in the United States, I think. So that we have to take this within the Japanese concept. But still, so there are a couple of questions. Hiroki, for instance, wants to know that if the policies are not popular, why does Abe keep winning elections? Mm-hmm. And so that's always been sort of right. So the rating falls to 8%, and then, you know, before you know it, he's won another snap election. Can you explain that to us? Either one of you. I mean, I don't know who would be more comfortable to try to give us the Japanese Politics 101 lecture in 3 minutes.
Oh, why he has been able to win elections?
So I actually have some slides on this that
take us back to that.
Maybe I can put up here. So so one thing that we can say is that this is a figure of voting behavior in lower house elections from 2003 until 2017. And the bottom blue bars are votes for the LDP, and the light blue are Kome, the coalition partner. And the gray bars up there are abstentions, right? So the total is all Japanese eligible voters, and everything else is opposition parties. And what we see is basically under Abe, starting in 2012, the LDP's absolute number of votes have not really increased. What the LDP has been good at is churning out basically the same level of support in election after election. But if you look at 2009 and 2012, the LDP's number of votes has actually declined since that 2009 election, where they were blown out by the DPJ. What's happened is abstentions have increased dramatically. So the opposition parties aren't getting much support from the Japanese voter. So arguably what the LDP has been able to do is to keep voters not upset at it enough that they are willing to cast their lot in for the opposition. So it's arguably a story of opposition failure, and it's arguably a story of the LDP being acceptable enough that voters aren't willing to vote against it. And you see that because Japan's electoral system now is relatively majoritarian, these results in terms of voting behavior result in this seat distribution where the LDP has very large majorities in the Diet, despite not really securing a very large share of the vote compared to other elections. So that's one answer. I mean, I could go on, but I think that's one important one.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and right now we are, of course, in this COVID situation, and we have a couple of questions on that, which also ties into this popularity thing and also into the power story. So, Kay wants to know if Abe has so much power now, right? I mean, the Kante, the cabinet office, has so much power. Why is the COVID handling so relatively weak? And then Robbie also wants to know why you're talking about the empowerment of the region, or the lack of the empowerment of the regions, depending on how you want to look at it, as a constraining force to that power, when in the United States, so you could argue, for instance, in Tokyo, that Koike, the governor of Tokyo, has basically saved Abe from himself because he's doing such a great job. But so how does that really work, and how does that compare to the United States? So does Abe have a lot of power? Then why is he not more powerful in this presentation of the COVID situation? Or does he not? Then what do we learn from that?
No,
Maybe
I have been thinking about, could I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this, and as I have been strongly arguing that Prime Minister has expanded its power, but I think it is if you look at the legal structure of Japan on how to deal with pandemic or spread of disease, I think most of powers are held by the local governors. So it is very difficult for the central government to formulate policies. And so I think this is something the political scientists really have not looked at. And so if the legal design, the legal system is designed in such a way, then it is very hard for a powerful prime minister. Even when prime minister is powerful, it is very hard for him to deal with the situation. For example, we have Hokenjo, which we call them health center in English, which carries out these PCR examinations and tracks how the disease has been spreading. Do you know who has power over these health stations in Tokyo? It is the head of the ward, Shibuya ward or Minato ward. And it is 2 levels below the prime minister, and it is really hard to understand for the prime minister to what's going on in Minato ward or Shinjuku ward, which is really the center of the pandemic. So I think when the legal structure is in design in such a way, it is very hard. And we have not, and the Japanese or even the Americans or Europeans or anyone in the world has not really experienced pandemic at this level. So I think if we have experienced this level of pandemic, for example, in 1960s or 1950s, probably we have structured the legal system in such a way to give legal authority to deal with the situation to the central government, but we have not done this. So I think that's my answer.
Let me ask a shift topics, unless Philip, you want to add to this, or you?
Go ahead.
Is that okay? Okay, let me ask you a question about your sort of thing, which is security. So when Abe came to power, there was a lot of talk about why is Abenomics about economics? So Abenomics, of course, is 3 areas, right? So it's macroeconomics and fiscal policy and structural reform and all of this about economics, when everybody thought that Abe was actually personally not really that interested in the economy. He was much more interested in changing Article 9 of the Constitution and increasing sort of Japan's profile in geopolitics, right? And Nicholas has a question. So that's my question, right? So what happened there? Is it just that he needed the yen? And Nicholas wants to know whether the COVID-19 situation allows that topic to come back up, or maybe the China situation allows that topic to come back up, or where does that stand? Where is the Article 9 debate, and what's Abe doing in that regard?
So I think you're absolutely right in the sense that the #1 priority for Abe is constitutional reform, and it's been so for many years. I don't think the economic part is completely irrelevant in the sense that Japan having a strong and robust economy is consistent with his agenda to make Japan strong. But from a political standpoint, I think it's fair to characterize the way Abe has governed is to use economic reforms as a way to maintain his popularity and public support and try to basically pass less popular legislation, whether it be collective self-defense collective self-defense or the secrecy law. Those kinds of legislation are not very popular and tend to elicit a lot of pushback. So the strategy has been, let's do those relatively soon after elections and pivot back to Abenomics. So by the time an election comes around, the prime minister's popularity has recovered to a level where we can get reelected again. So that has been the strategy. And it's not to say that Abenomics has been superfluous or ineffective, because I think there have been elements of Abenomics that have legitimately implemented important reforms. But I think in terms of Abe's personal priorities, it's definitely in the areas that you suggest.
So a lot of the questions that we're getting are about the sort of crystal ball, what's going to happen in the fall. And I think it ties into this question directly, right? So is Abe going to stay on? Is there going to be another snap election? Levy points out that the Komeito may be against that. There's a lot of talk in Japan right now. Let's do another one of these snap elections, which I still don't understand whether that's more of a kabuki or a real thing or what that actually is, but it's a good show. Is Abe staying on? He was supposed to celebrate the Olympics, and Abenomics was supposed to be done with 2020. And now, you know, last week in this place, we discussed the un-Olympics. And so there's this, like, you know, Abenomics. There's no endpoint now, right? There's no celebration. We've done it. So what's going to happen in the fall? What's your prediction? And is Abe going to stay on, or is there going to be a successor, or, you know, what's going on there? Both of you. Philip, let's start with you, and then let's have... Well,
Harukata probably talks to people about this more often in Tokyo, so why doesn't he go first on this one?
I think we have, no, it really depends on this COVID-19 situation. I think we probably, at least the Tokyo area have to go the second stage of emergency declaration by the fall. So I think it's very difficult for the government to call a general election under the spread of COVID-19. And the second point is that the second declaration of the emergency situation probably will bring down the cabinet approval rate even more. So it is now currently the end of 20s, I mean like 28 or 29. And it will push down to 22 or 23. That's very dangerous because no cabinet has recovered when it has experienced the reduction of cabinet approval rate to the level of 22 or 23. So I'm very sorry to say this for Prime Minister Abe, but I think it's the crystal ball or the forecast has to be very pessimistic for him. But it's too bad because he has not been handled. He was very, even despite this decentralization and power of local governance, he has managed this situation so poorly. So, you know, too bad.
I have to, every time I hear somebody from Japan, Germany, or Canada, or Australia say, our government is doing poorly, I'll say, just put it in relative terms, and you look okay. Philip, what's your crystal ball? Is there going to be a snap election, or who's going to be the next prime minister? If there were an election, is his right hand Suga? Are you going to be the next guy, or?
Well, because of the pandemic, I'm unable to talk to people and do interviews and so forth. So I'm engaging in pure speculation. What I would speculate is that there was a storyline that the government had in mind. They declare victory against COVID, which they did, that the Japan model was successful. They pivot to the economy, which is Abe's strong point. And by the fall, Abe would be in a very strong position to call an election and win because the opposition is still very much in disarray. And I think the fact that COVID is now making a comeback makes that scenario very difficult, as Harukata pointed out. And so I think now it's difficult. I'm not quite as pessimistic as Harukata because the opposition is in such a bad situation that it's not implausible to me that if Abe called an election today, that the LDP could manage to win quite a few seats. But yeah, I'm now a little bit less inclined to think that an election will happen in the fall than I was maybe a month ago. In terms of the next prime minister, I don't know. I have people that I like, but I really don't have a pulse on the internal dynamics of the LDP at the moment.
So let's talk a little bit more about your forthcoming book. It's a very careful, rigorous academic analysis of various aspects of Abenomics. It contains a few chapters on the macroeconomics, and then it has a few chapters on sort of the structural reforms and the policy reform, of course. And so I have two questions. One is actually, Robbie has a list with grades from A to F on the various reform measures, and he would like to invite you to grade what you think the reform outcome was. So tourism, agriculture, healthcare, electoral reform, labor, energy, corporate governance. You know, did he do well? I mean, is Abenomics successful? And then I would add to that, you know, even as you're grading, Philip, you sounded a little bit negative on, you know, so there was a sort of a dubious undertone, and, you know, will it stick? And it's a sort of it's a media, it's great marketing, it's great, but the question I would have for you then is, will this stick? So, in 5 years from now, however long you want to look into the future, next year, is Abenomics going to stick? I mean, is it going to revert? You know, so is if we switched over to the DPJ, are they going to undo some of these things? Or who even is the opposition now? I don't know. Is this reversible, or is this now the new Japan? Has Abenomics really changed sort of the trajectory of the country?
So there's a lot to unpack here, which I probably can't do in a short time period. But on your last point, I would say that unlike the United States, most of the reforms that Abe implemented, I would say, are not sharply partisan. Like, you know, work-life balance, womenomics. They're not the kinds of things that the opposition party would come in and immediately try to dismantle. So in that sense, I think the reforms that Abe implemented are more likely to stick, at least the Abenomics economic reforms in the long term. On Robert's grades, I won't comment on all of them, but I think it's fair to say that labor reform, Steve Vogel has a chapter on this in our volume, he would rank higher. And agriculture, Casey Niza and Patty McLaughlin have a great piece on, and they might rank this somewhat higher as well. I contributed one on energy, which I'm not sure I would give energy a C. I might go a little bit lower on that one. Corporate governance, I think I'm inclined to agree that was an area where significant progress was made. But I'll leave that at that and let Harukata chime in if he has any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Philip said it's non-partisan. I would say most of the reforms really started out in under DPJ government, and Prime Minister Abe took those ideas and he implemented them more effectively because he knew how to formulate policies. And so I think and also Japan does not have a lot of choices. You know, we have to go more digital, or we have to deal with demographic change and also climate change. So I think we don't really have much and also we have to deal with fiscal crisis. So I think the future government, I think it will be another LDP government, but I think it will carry out the existing policies. I think there won't be so these reforms will stay in, I think.
Yeah, and I would, in my book, in my work, where I look at the business perspective of this, I would also rank the labor reforms much higher. So I would agree with Steve, I think. So I thought that Robbie was a little bit harsh there, but so I have one more question. I think probably for Takenaka Sensei, since I'm at UC San Diego and Chalmers Johnson was here, who wrote in 1982, wrote a book about, bring the state back in and METI and the power of the bureaucracy. And I have a question from Yoshi that is actually my question to you. So if we step back from the Abenomics and your story about the centralization of the power in the Kante, in the cabinet office, and so that means that the ministries have a reduced power. And you talk about the processes, but I would be interested, together with Yoshi, what that means for the so there's a process and the outcome question, right? So the outcome is, does that change the outcome of policy measures that this power is now concentrated? And Yoshi is more interested in the process. So are there more struggles for power, or this whole issue about sontaku, which is this assuming that the prime minister wants something, and so we do it to please him, and that would then result in sort of competition among the ministries, and that would be very inefficient, and so the processes would no longer be inefficient, the outcomes would be different. Do you have any thoughts on what this reduction of power of the ministries actually means for the Japanese political economy?
Well, I think it has made it possible for the prime ministers to come up with more cohesive and consistent policies because he can overcome resistance from the bureaucrats more easily. And the good example, I give you two examples from our external policy. One is TPP, and I think this is really the first time for Japan to exercise leadership in global arenas. After United States has withdrawn from TPP, Japan took up the efforts and went on with the remaining countries. And before that, for example, if had this happened in 1990s under the Kaifu cabinet, probably the Ministry of Agriculture said, "Yay, we don't really have to open our agriculture market, so we have to thank United States for withdrawing, and there's no need to restart negotiations." That would have happened, but Prime Minister can make, when you make international negotiations, Japan has to come up with a consistent policy, but it was very difficult before because of, as Chairman Johnson said, because the bureaucrats were very powerful and they wanted to protect their turfs, right? And the other example is the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Vision. Again, this combines security and economic policies. And again, this is really the first time Japan came up with concrete security and economic policies as a package. And this is also, thanks to growth of the power of Cabinet Secretariat and the Prime Minister's power. Okay. So I think there are problems such as this sontaku issue, or sensing the feelings of the prime ministers by the bureaucrats. But I think the outcome, is we have some positive outcomes.
Great. Well, on this positive note, it's time to stop, which is probably a good thing. Thank you both for joining me, and you've done a great job in answering all these questions and laying out the current situation. We will look forward to your book. And let me just do my final screen share here before I end. Thank you everybody for joining us today. And next week we'll have Gen Isayama. He will talk about the culture of entrepreneurship, innovation, and change in small and large companies in Japan. Gen is one of Japan's foremost venture capitalist and corporate change consultants. And so please join us next week. Thank you, Phillip. Thank you, Harukata, for being with us today. It was great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for
everybody
having
else, please come and see us again next week.